Now we'd like to continue the conversation. We have a really special fireside chat planned for you that I'll be moderating actually, with none other than Yat Siu, co-founder and chairman of Animoca Brands. We'll be discussing a lot of topics, but one of them of which, why Web3 matters. I'd love to welcome Yat to the stage. Please give him a warm round of applause. Okay, so since we are short for time, we're going to get right into this, but we have a really incredible talk plan for you here today. So some of the things we'll be discussing is actually the very question, why does Web3 matter? Why are we all here? And what is different now? What's coming in the future? Yeah, I'd like to get started by you giving a brief introduction, a little bit about what Animoca Brands is doing, what they're looking at,
Sure.
and what's going on right now in the ecosystem.
Yeah, my pleasure. So my name is Yat. I'm chairman and co-founder of Animoca Brands. I think many people might know us as being a fairly prolific investor in this space. We've done over 500 actually portfolio companies now in Animoca Brands. I think the most well-known ones within the group subsidiary are like companies like Sandbox, but of course we're seed money in OpenSea, Axie Infinity, Magic Eden, Pixels most recently, and so forth. But anyway, without going into the details of what we're doing, we have this strong belief in what we call the shared network effect. And sharing the network effect is a philosophical investment approach even and growth approach that we have to Animoca Brands. And let me explain why, and sort of quickly skipping over some of the topics here, just when it comes about sort of what's most important.
Right.
The most important thing we think today, especially when you talk about the age of the internet, is network effects. And it comes from our data, right? Every time when you basically share a photo on Instagram, every time you basically post something on TikTok, actually what you're doing is you're creating network effects. That's what's really valuable. But in Web 2, these network effects are worth trillions of dollars in these isolated platforms in which we have to depend on, right? So you don't own your followers on X. You don't own your followers on Instagram.
Actually, you don't own your data.
You don't own your data. You don't own anything. And data, the derivative of data, is a network effect. And these network effects are worth trillions of dollars, right? And it's actually, from our perspective, also a great source of inequity. But what happens in Web 3 and why we invest the way that we do and why we build the way that we do is that network effects are shared. So you see this today when you think about crossing liquidity across, for instance, L1, L2s as a very basic version of that. When you bridge assets across, actually the whole network benefits. So in other words, if Polygon grows, or if Arbitrum grows, or if Optimism grows, Ethereum grows as well because they're all interconnected. In fact, they're sort of locked together. This is not true for Web 2. If Facebook grows, who cares what happens at Fortnite, or who cares what happens at Amazon? They're actually not related to each other. And so that also, the difference also is that they're permissionless. So that means that when you build something on one platform, actually the network effects flow throughout the entire ecosystem. So the mental model that we think of, imagine in the future where you took these companies as networks, Google, TikTok, Facebook, Amazon, whatever, Apple, and you had a way in which permissionlessly they could merge together. Just dream for a moment. What would be the growth of the network? What would be the value of that network? It wouldn't be going up 10 or 20%. It would increase by 100, 200, 300x, as we have seen in the age of property rights when we went from physical property rights, and now we're going to the age of digital property rights. So the whole point around this is basically, in Web 3, the network is anti-monopolistic by nature. They're interconnected. So even if Ronin, which is, again, one that we backed, with Axie Infinity growing really fast, grows really, really successfully, and Pixels as a game grows really successfully, the entire Web 3 gaming economy grows with it.
Right.
This is not true if Fortnite does well. Only Epic cares. Everyone else is like, I wish I had that.
They're all isolated in Web 2, whereas here
Exactly.
it's all kind of like the interoperable nature
Correct.
of the system.
Yes. Yeah,
Right.
and so that means in this space, you can't actually succeed by investing in one or two companies and hoping to get a winner in a zero-sum outcome, because you don't have a zero-sum network, right? They're all shared. So we believe that in the future, we will have to have thousands and thousands of portfolio companies, for instance, and you see this already in Web 3. It's not just us, whether it's Coinbase or whether it's Binance or whether it's OKX, they all have venture teams. But you don't see the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, Deutsche Börse, for instance, make investments. You don't see Apple making investments. Apple has $163 billion of cash that's sitting in Ireland, doing nothing really. And they don't have an ecosystem fund. Imagine what would happen if Apple actually took 10% of their cash and put it in an ecosystem fund that would invest in, basically App Store companies. What would happen? Well, you'd have a much healthier ecosystem.
Right.
Everyone would be very happy to pay 30%, right? There would be growth, it would flourish, and actually the value of Apple's equity would be higher because they would own stakes in companies that are successful in the ecosystem rather than basically just be a rent collector and collect
In
cash.
a place where all ships, right, the rising tide lifts all ships.
Exactly. And that's basically our philosophy. And so we think in Web3, everyone has to be a capitalist. Everyone has to be an investor to grow in that space, which we can maybe cover later.
Yeah, and that's a very hot topic because I know capitalism in the US, there's a different kind of narrative going on right now. And in fact, many gamers fear capitalism and fear in the US, but there's different narratives around the world. And actually, I think that'll be a really interesting topic that we can get into later.
Yeah.
But we're going to start with, and we're going to continue with this network effect and why Web3 matters, why we're actually here, right?
Yes. So maybe we can quickly cover this topic here. Then I go, for instance, actually this one, when you have stakeholder alignment through ownership. So what we mean by that is that in Web3, every person is a stakeholder. Even if you own one token in Ethereum or in Polygon or in Immutable, it doesn't really matter. If you own a token, you actually become a stakeholder, which means also you can govern in a network where millions and millions, actually billions of people can own an interest in the network that they're participating in. Now just think about that. I think Apple or Facebook, one of the two, have about 80,000 shareholders. That's not bad. But that means of the 1-point-something billion people that use Facebook, only 80,000 groups and individuals have maybe a vested interest in the success of Facebook. Doesn't actually really make sense. And then we wonder why we have this sort of class divide between essentially what we think is essentially a capital economy, which is the shareholder, and a labor economy, which is basically people who use Facebook. But they don't think of it this way. They think they're having fun. But actually, every person who uses Facebook and Instagram is actually labor to the platform, and they add value to the network, right?
You've actually described them before as virtually employees,
but
right?
basically, yeah, I mean, we think of them as serfs because they're working for free, effectively.
Working for free,
Yes.
yeah.
But what actually happens in Web3, because you own tokens, you're now a stakeholder. So even if you just own a token in, let's call it Ethereum, and someone else is building somewhere around the world, you grow by participation simply because you're a form of an equity holder in it by holding a token. And there's no other framework in the world in which you can imagine any system in which you can have ownership across 1 billion people. Like you can't have ownership in a company. You can't have 1 billion shareholders in any company, but you can have 1 billion token holders. And you can have 1 billion stakeholders. And that to us is basically what it means. And there's alignment to stakeholders when you have an interest in it, then actually you will actually participate and have a, you know, like if you, if an Uber driver, you know, I give this example often, if an Uber driver actually was a shareholder in Uber, not a big one, right? Every Uber driver was a shareholder in Uber. What would the network of Uber look like? The drivers who would be driving in Uber would be more than happy 10 years down the road to retire and have automated cars essentially take over because they've helped grow the value of that network and they're participant in it. Instead, it's an adversarial relationship. We have only adversarial relationships in Web 2. We're fighting with Instagram. We're fighting with Twitter. We're fighting with Facebook. Yes, there's a duality around it, but in reality, they are not our friends. And we don't think of them as any kind of loyalty, right? That's why we can switch from TikTok to Instagram to whatever next platform that comes. But if you own the stake in that system, your loyalty will be totally different, which is why things like NFTs work. And you think about the tribalism that you see in L1, L2s. It's exactly the same thing because people own Bitcoin. They're like Bitcoin maxis. And you know, whether this is a good or bad thing doesn't even matter. What matters is that now they're loyal to the network because they have ownership.
That is so powerful. Yeah, that loyalty because they feel like they're a part of it. And when I started doing these tracks at like FinTech and Web3, other shows or tech shows, it was always a question, why Web3? They just didn't get it. They just, from the tech world, why do we even need that technology? What is the difference? And this is it. This is you're all shareholders in a greater ecosystem instead of like consumers to be extracted from.
I think one of the challenges that I think people have often is that they don't understand it because they think of blockchain as a technology. And so they compare it to, well, MySQL is a faster database, more efficient.
Yeah.
But what I think people need to understand is that blockchain inherently is not neutral because it is defended by a capitalist framework. And because it's based on a consensus mechanism, it's inherently political in nature. So what blockchain is a political, social movement in one form or the other. It's capitalism that defends it, right? If you want to control the Ethereum network, you got to buy a bunch of tokens. What happens to the price of the tokens? It becomes really expensive. The capitalist framework defends the power of the network, right? And so the capitalist incentive defends the Bitcoin network for the miners. The point simply being is that it's already protected by interest. And like a democracy, we might say, oh, you know, some places in the world are really efficient. If you want to build a railway to go from one place to another, you could do it really fast if you have a tyrannical government that basically just railroads over everything. But you can't do that in a democratic country. And it's true that it's less efficient. But what it does is protect the interest of those who are involved, and it has also minority protection, which is the reason why all of us here probably would, at the end of the day, despite the fact that, top-down hierarchical systems may arguably be faster and more efficient, you choose not to live in a country like that, say like North Korea,
Right.
just because it's more efficient, because you want to protect your rights. And to protect your rights, you need to have a democratic framework that's built around consensus. And in the digital world, that's what blockchain is.
Wow, that's so powerful. I mean, that is the framework right there for what we're all doing here, really, essentially, and the difference in this movement and the shift from one paradigm to the next in this web version of the Web3 where we can now have the free transfer of value.
Mm-hmm.
And I love your point about instead of it just being efficient and getting it done, no, it's less efficient, but we all have a say now. We're all shareholders in this.
We're
and
stakeholders, yes.
sorry, and therefore increasing the network effect.
Yes.
Like that's so powerful. And so you talk about capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
I know when people hear capitalism, they might think a certain way, or some people fear capitalism, especially in the U.S. Can we touch on that briefly
Of
about
course.
what you mean by that exactly?
So first, I think, we all know what capitalism is, generally speaking, but true capitalism requires a free market. And I think one of the challenges that we have, essentially, in Web 2, we think there's a free market because companies are making profits. But the free market that we see, basically, between Apple and Facebook, and really the networks that they have, looks like this, which is basically not a free market at all. When you, for instance, look at buying advertising, and do you actually get to interact with the person you want to buy the advertising from? You're interacting with an algorithm that decides, not in your interest, but in the interest of the platform where it goes. That, to me, by the way, sounds like hyper-socialism, right?
Yeah.
The state decides what's good for you. But what actually benefits the state, in this case, the company, which we think of it like a country, actually isn't to your benefit. And so, by the way, these top 10 companies in the world, they're all data companies, save one, have $1 trillion of cash, never mind the tens of trillions that they're worth, right? That is more wealth generated, really, if you think about the last decade by these companies, than over the last 50 to 100 years, collectively amongst the biggest companies in the world. But I go back to this point, which is that when you have a free market, actually, you have what's created in Web3, a way in which value, see, in Web3, the value is shared across because it's an open network, because it's anti-monopolistic. So I'll give an example. For those of you who remember OpenSea, which was one of our portfolios and still the number 2, number 3 marketplace in the world, and they were constantly vampire attacked. Why?
Yeah.
Because their data was open to everyone. The structure in which you could actually go after them was there, which means you could actually be truly capitalist. You could say, I offer you a better service, or I can give you free tokens, or I give you better incentives for you to use my product. And many have tried. It wasn't until Blur that really succeeded in sort of changing it. But before, many have tried. The customers themselves benefited from it. It's like, imagine if you could target every Amazon customer by knowing who bought, I don't know, a Porsche car, for instance.
It's powerful.
Right?
Yeah.
Or if you could authentically target every person who has, a Rolex or might live in Dortmund or something. It doesn't really matter. The point is that now you can really target them, whereas today you can't do that you can't really properly do that in Web 2. So the value and the reason why people have a loss of faith in capitalism is because builders and investors get all the value.
Right.
Post-COVID, $42 trillion of value, new value was generated post-COVID in over the 3 years after. 2/3 of that value went to the 1 percentile.
Wow.
And the rest went to nothing. And we can say, okay, we understand why that is, but that's because who benefited are basically the ones who own equity, who are shareholders and stuff, right? The ones who could buy equity. And in a world where the majority of the world is still in a labor economy, they basically had the value of cash, which what happened to that. We don't have to talk about QE, for instance.
Right.
They lost their value. And now children today, for the first time in the general class, are making less money than their parents. And that, of course, brings in a totally different mindset, which is why people are becoming anti-capitalist.
Right, or they fear it
or they
because
fear it,
of
right.
that lack maybe of the financial literacy that
Right.
you...
But then in Web3, the value goes directly to the end users in a much more distributed manner. If you're a creator, for instance, NFTs, billions of dollars are sold in NFTs still, right? And will continue to grow. But 90% of the value goes to creators and owners of these NFTs, right? Whereas in the Web2 platforms, companies like Spotify, they monopolize it. But there's no musician in the world that makes money selling music on Spotify.
No,
They have to do all
no
these
way.
other things to do that. So Web3, I think, really sort of brings a new faith in capitalism. And I think this goes down to a little bit to this point here, which is around sort of why the tokens have a value.
Yeah.
Right? I know we don't have a lot of time, but tokens aren't only representations of, sometimes when they say the term cryptocurrency, I think it sort of tells the wrong story, because then people start to focus too much on the currency word of it, when in fact we think of tokens as representations of network effects, right? So if Instagram had a token, it's not really a currency, it's a representation of the value of the network effect. Ethereum is not a currency. Bitcoin is not a currency of sorts. It's an ownership in a network. When you own that, you're a participant, you can partake in it, and you're a member of that network, and it's a representation of that. And that, by the way, is a construct that hadn't existed before,
Right.
because it combines the financial utility, which is the liquidity and network effects of the finance world, with the application utility, which is that of the application itself. This, by the way, used to be divided, right? Facebook took about 6 years and $1.3 billion to actually become cash flow positive and sustainable as a business. The financial utility was taken care of by VCs. They were capturing that aspect of it, and they separated it from the utility. There were two different companies, two different entities. A token represents both. And so today in the market, why I think a lot of people get confused is because the financial utility of the market is really only known to a certain subset of people. People who are in banking, people who take companies IPO, people who are in finance. So it's alien to them. They don't understand. And I think they've also been grown up with this classic value of, labor is good. It's a classic Protestant sort of value in terms of,
that you need to get a job,
work,
be in the system.
work is not just healthy, but it's spiritual, right? And I think that's important. But I think the next paradigm we're shifting is that we're going to a world where everyone needs to become a capital owner, and tokens is a way in which we all become capital owners.
Oh, absolutely. That is really powerful, because I know that new users, they come in and they see all these airdrops and they don't understand, what is this for? This free money being printed out of thin air that has no inherent value, but yet it's so absolutely valuable to the network that is dropping this airdrop.
So let me give you the stat here, which is interesting, not including 24, basically. Over the last 3 years, over $21.7 billion in what you might call free money was dropped to community. There is not a single transfer of value that's gone to, let's call it, common or regular users in the history of certainly the last 20, 30 years, other than government giving out grants or something like that, right? But what's interesting around this is, people say, oh, it's free money. It seems kind of Ponzi and scam-like.
Yeah.
But let me give you an example of what that free money actually really is in our world, in gaming, for instance, like with Pixels or with ApeCoin, for instance. So in advertising, we spend about $100 billion a year. We spend about $100 billion a year advertising games in Web2, which is a $250+ billion industry today. The average cost per paying user is $86.
Wow.
Which means that if you're an indie game developer today, you're broadly screwed,
Right.
for lack of a better word, right? Which is why you don't see many indie game developers before. 10 years ago, it was different, because the CPI was less than $1, and today it's $86.
There's less competition.
But why is it $86? Because the market in which you can acquire these users is monopolized by Facebook, Google, Apple, and all the known parties that you know out there. And how much of that money that an advertiser spends on advertising, or that $100 billion, goes back to the gamer or the gaming industry that you're actually acquiring and supporting? And the answer is zero, or close to zero, right? Not even to mention that there's a 30% extractive tax they take for just existing on the platform, like the highest form of rentier economy you can think of, right? It's as feudal as it gets, right? And so what happens actually when you do airdrops is, instead of paying the platformer fee to target the user you want, you pay the end user the money directly. So of course the trick is the mechanism of how you attract the right end user. So in the early days, when you're acquiring these users, people were just saying, oh, are you really human? Okay. And then you had bots and so on. We're going through these stages of how you actually find out if he's a real user. And now people have to play games, and they have to prove their identity, and they have to, some people, proof of humanity does it with a palm, WorldCoin does it with the eyes, whatever it is, prove that you're human and doing something, and then I give you value, right? And that's because today, only the platform really understands if you're truly human or not, but you don't know what that is. So you go into an algorithm and you're saying, I'm going to spend $1 million to do advertising, and you get a result. You have no idea what happens in the result. For me, as far as I'm concerned, it's the biggest scam ever, right? And I think using things like GDPR is another way to say, look, privacy rules are there, so I have to remove all the information so you can target.
Right.
Well, who benefits, actually? The small companies completely screwed out of this, right? And anyway, we can talk about, that's a different topic altogether, but how large corporations then take advantage of regulation. But transparency is a game here. If I know that you're a real human, then I can give you value directly. Now, how much of that money, of the $20 billion that is spent on this so-called free money, goes back into the same economies, sometimes even more, right? So if you give money to the gamers that love your game, even if they don't spend money in your game, they'll spend money in another game, right? If you give money to builders or to users, Like when, during the time, during COVID, everyone basically, government gave out free money. That obviously had issues, with the capital economy.
Right.
But what did they do with the money? They actually spent it, right? Because that's what normal people do. They
Right.
spend their money and they engage in the culture and society in which they do, which is what happens when you do here. You give it to a corporation whose only purpose is to maximize profit. Even if the people behind the team say, maybe we should invest it. Shareholders didn't invest in the company so that they give the money out to grow the economy. They gave it to put it in Ireland and to have interest, right, in this case, right? So the thing is, again, in the future, marketing and these things are going to be completely upended. Airdrops, meme coins, all these things are just an expression of the times that we're in that basically show that value given to the end user creates stronger network effects. And these network effects become so powerful, which is why Web3, even though there's really only tens of millions active in it, I mean, you have hundreds of millions on crypto, but really only tens of millions in DeFi, it's a $2.5 trillion space. Right?
Wow.
So those network effects will amplify once we get to 100 million, 200 million, and a billion plus people.
Wow, that is just like laying the foundation for everything you need to know about why Web3 matters. What are these? I know even like a lot of creators and some of the companies I work with, they question, what are airdrops even essentially for? And I think this answers it perfectly. It's increasing that network effect by one way or another, by giving it back to the end user that then may spend it on other games, but in the end, it increases the value of the entire network.
Correct.
So it's a really powerful tool to be able to use that money in an efficient way, a much more efficient way that connects directly with the user, gives back to the user that are now stakeholders in the
Yes.
system.
Now, Kevin Kelly famously sort of coined this term about the 1,000 true fans.
Yeah.
And I think this is absolutely true when you think about things, what's happening in Web3. 1,000 true fans, or could be 10,000, could be 100,000 if all you care. The idea was if your 1,000 true fans can pay you $100 a year, then you get $100,000 for whatever that you do. That's not a bad business. For an SME, that's pretty decent. And you can accelerate and grow that, right? The problem is that when you go in Web2, you don't know who your 1,000 true fans are. You might have 1 million followers, but you have no idea whether they've watched your video 10,000 times or 1 time. You don't know whether they love you a lot or whether they love you a little. And that's the problem with Spotify as well. Right? And I liken it a little bit like, Web2 is fast food. Everything is McDonald's and Burger King and whatever, and we're going for the lowest common denominator, and they abstract those values, which is what we're now getting. We're basically getting fast food value.
Right.
We're not getting the kind of value that the internet is supposed to give us.
Yeah.
But actually what Web3 gives us, when people get confused about why is a Bored Ape worth $50,000, $60,000, or why is a Mochaverse worth $12,000, why are tokens worth what they are? Well, actually, they aggregate the network effects of the true fans, which you can really identify, and then you basically can build and expand from that, which also means, by the way, that if you have a Web3 business, you don't need 10 million customers, right? Like in Web2, unless you have 10, 20, 30, 100 million users, you're actually not investable. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, no,
right?
that is crazy.
Right? If you think about it,
completely
just
turns it upside down. Yeah.
And that's because those economies in Web2 are like North Korea. Right? North Korea has 40, 50 million people in the world, so it's much bigger than certainly Dortmund, much bigger than, say, Switzerland. But we all know where we choose to live. Switzerland might have 5 or 6 million people, but we'll choose to live there because the network effects are bigger, because I can have freedom and have property rights and have value generated that per ARPU, per user, per customer, per GDP is much bigger. Right? And that's because I actually have access to them. And in Web3, we can do this, right? So 1,000 true fans is I guess, another good analogy as to why Web3 really matters.
Absolutely, and that's like how we build that network effect little by every creator who's now in a creator economy brings those 1,000 true fans or even 100 super fans.
That's right.
I know, just to like touch on this point, I interviewed for my podcast, Spotty Wi-Fi. He was one of the first musicians to drop his NFTs on the blockchain. He had 5,000 streams on Spotify and like 2,000 followers on Twitter, and he made like $200,000 in 60 seconds in his drop because he had those true fans. What musician can do that with 5,000 streams on Spotify?
I think people confuse it often when they look at things like Bored Apes and say that seems so expensive. But then when you look at Rolexes, Birkin bags, Hermes, Gucci, whatever brand you would out there, they don't sell 10 million shoes or 10 million bags or 10 million cars. I mean, Sotheby's, which is of course a very high-end sort of, I guess, arts dealer, their entire customer base is about 200,000, and yet they're a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. If it was true that we all were only purchasing utility for its lowest cost, we wouldn't be spending 100 euros or 200 euros on a nice meal somewhere. There would be no Michelin restaurants in the world, for instance. We would all be wearing the same color clothes. And they should probably be black because they can't get dirty that easily. And we only be driving one kind of car, which is the cheapest one that gets us from point A to point B. And yet we choose to wear different colors. We choose to do different things. We wear tattoos. We buy jewelry. They're all points of our own self-expression, which form part of our identity, which is really another important part of our ownership.
Wow, there's just so many things. We could go on with this conversation, I'm sure, for hours. And Yat is such an eloquent, amazing speaker. I had the pleasure of, speaking alongside you and listening to you at conferences around the world. And speaking of that, as we wrap up now, Web3 is truly global. I know that there are so many things happening outside the U.S. is, caught everybody's eye on the regulation terms, but there are so many other jurisdictions and areas in the world that are doing amazing things. I know the Asia economy is really flourishing as well.
I'm part of the Web3 Advisory Task Force for the government in Hong Kong that basically helps push Web3, which is again another example of how Asia is pushing Web3 because they're actually putting industry players into the government to help them sort of direct it. I mean, how many people here know that, for instance, Hong Kong actually launched an Ethereum spot ETF? Yeah, it's not a good number, but basically more than half don't know, right? The point is that, again, it's an example, right, that, Asia is leading the way, on top of Bitcoin spot ETFs. I mean, Hong Kong even has a GameFi index, which is Bloomberg, which has a Bloomberg ticker. Not that they're now turned it into an ETF yet, but it just kind of shows where it's going. The Prime Minister in Japan has said that Web3 in the metaverse is part of his national agenda, right? When you think about the average Korean under the age of 30, 60% of them own crypto, right? Southeast Asia is getting most of its sort of new economic developments from crypto in places like the Philippines. The equivalent of the SEC sort of chair was the opening speaker of the YGG conference.
Wow.
Which is basically like a game guild, if you don't know, in the Philippines. But it's a completely different landscape.
It's a whole other world.
And I think there's two, as we wrap up, there's two sort of narratives to understand here why that's the case. One, like most places around the world, they're looking at how to engage youth. Right? And young people don't really have a way in which they can partake in this one. To me, crypto, Web3, blockchain, it's the hope and opportunity for the younger generation. And not dissimilar from how Silicon Valley and the tech industry did that for, I guess, many of us here, from, say, 10, 20, 30 years ago. That's kind of one narrative. And how do you engage the youth, which is your future, right? If you don't invest in the future of youth, then you don't have a future. But the other one, the other thematics are de-dollarization. In particular, when China came up with a Web3 strategy paper, they didn't actually say you can trade crypto in China. You could do this through Hong Kong, which is a part of China, but it's a free market.
Right.
It's really about de-dollarization, right? Basically not having the dollar be used as the kind of weapon that it is. And that's a thematic around multiple places. And the other final point is removal of dependencies of, let's call it, forms of digital colonialism. So when you look at the rest of the world, you can argue that China and Korea have been sort of have anti-free market in which they blocked access to maybe some of the biggest websites in the world. Sure. But then look what happened. I would argue that Europe does not have a single, really with Spotify accepted, European tech company that is independent. I think Europe has been digitally colonized by Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Google, you name it, right? And that's because you've let them come in and just take over. And now there's a situation where you're dependent on them.
Right.
When just start of the year, Canada news companies were deplatformed by Facebook because they didn't want to pay the news tax.
That's crazy.
The idea that a democratic country can be muted for a moment in time by a platform is ridiculous. It's crazy to think about.
It's going backwards.
Right? It's going backwards.
Yeah.
And yet here we are thinking around, oh, this is okay, right? And so when you look at places like Asia, they're like, we don't want that. And they've always tried to fight that. And so pushing Web3 is a political agenda in those places because they know that they missed the Web2 train. And there's not enough of a balance of power in the world. And so that's why they're pushing it. Rather than, of course, they'd like it if an Asian company was successful. But if it's decentralized, then at least you have a form of governance control that isn't maintained by one. And it's only gotten worse over time. So that's those are the many thematics. The Middle East is, by the way, the same.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but that's probably for another topic.
No, so many topics, but this is, guys, you've got to check. Yat Siu is speaking around the world at many different conferences. We had the pleasure and honor of hosting him today here in Dortmund at conference. He's got so many big ideas, and just laying the framework for why this matters is the most important thing right now as we onboard new users, as we look to the future, as we invest in the youth and get the youth involved. So it's about that mentality shift, right? About the way we think about things, and maybe capitalism isn't what we thought it was. It's actually something that's going to liberate us in the end and allow us to be these stakeholders, as you've mentioned, and take a part in this network effect. So that was such an amazing conversation. We hope to catch up with you again soon. We also done a podcast on this, on the Crypto Megan podcast. If you want to see more of what Yat speaks about of, the economy in the digital age and financial literacy, as well as capitalism. And yeah, I hope we can catch up again somewhere around the world. And this was an amazing conversation. Thank you all for being here so much, and thank you, Yat.
Pleasure. Thank you for being. Thank you.